contention is that exports from Sri Lanka have declined because of the tariffs. If I were to say that all tariffs, all taxes are rebated or exempted, what would your response be?
I do not, when you say rebated, there are various systems by which you rebate. So there's a whole administrative issue about the nature of the rebate. I don't want to say it's the only reason for the decline. But I am struck by the strong correlation. And I think there are many policy measures that need to be considered if we're thinking about stimulating exports in Sri Lanka. So I take the opportunity of your question to correct any misimpression I might leave that this is the one thing you need to do, and after that you sail off into the sunset. I think there are many ingredients to successful export performance, but I did want to highlight this particular one as being imperative. I also think, for instance, that the trade agreements that are being considered are very important. If you look at the access that firms based in Sri Lanka have to foreign markets compared to the access that firms have in other parts of the world, the firms in Sri Lanka have less access because it has not participated in opening markets for its exporters in other countries. I think, in addition, there's a huge amount of effort that needs to go into innovation. With the wage levels in Sri Lanka, you need to have products that are more innovative. And so I think there's a whole agenda that we've been working on. So I would say you got me if you interpreted what I said as being only the tariffs. But I wanted to highlight the tariffs because I do think they're a part of the solution.
I was in the Export Development Board for 17 years. And my contention is exports have declined because of the fact that investments or investors, the risk for investment has been very high due to various reasons. One reason is during the 30-year war, there were no investments. And in 2009, the war was won by the Sri Lankan forces, but the peace was not won. Therefore, the risk, one of the risks is the ethnic conflict has not been resolved yet. In fact, the OECD, in their country risk classification, says that previously the risk was 6 and currently the risk is 6. As against Afghanistan, 7 and 7. So the risk is one of the main factors that has to be resolved. Then secondly, the red tape.
I'm sorry, I have to say that you could ask questions and to differ from statements because we have to give an opportunity for others. Thank you.
Let me just add on this point of the risk. There is political risk, but we had a very interesting meeting today with people from many different industries in Sri Lanka. And there is a second risk which they face, and that is policy uncertainty. And so I would concur with the point about risk, but I would add that where you have a tariff structure that is continuously changing, the investors don't have the foggiest idea about what their long-run cost structure is. And what we heard from them was that perhaps they would rather have less protection, but secure protection. An environment that is secure with respect to policy is very critical and an important ingredient, and especially for foreign investors who are going to come here and have to take a long view. So I think policy uncertainty is another key ingredient.
But on the question or the statement that has been made here, I kind of disagree. There is a blue ribbon apparel company, a gentleman from that many years ago made a presentation, and he said that some of the biggest investments came during the darkest days of Sri Lanka at the height of the JVP, etc., because they were partnering with firms. So international firms were partnering with great firms in Sri Lanka, and they felt their greatest risk was mitigated because they had good partners, and they worried less about the country risk. So I differ on that.
But they weren't partnering to export.
They were.
Well, why are the exports at the level they are? And when we see they weren't partnering to innovate in export areas, because we don't see much change in the composition of exports.
Yes, so that was mainly in the apparel, and this narrative is about 15 years ago. But that is to dispel the question about the risk, country risk, which I don't agree with. Maybe I can...
No, so let's distinguish, and I think it's important, between the generic country risk, which was being mentioned, and the other risks that are there in the environment.
Yes. So, Professor, maybe if you can explain to the benefit of the audience the link between exports and wages. Why export dynamism will lead to higher wages?
Well, basically, economic growth and increases in productivity are going to allow firms to pay higher wages. And it turns out, obviously, that your most productive firms are the ones who export. And we see a lot of empirical evidence, and it just makes sense, because if you're able to export, you have to be able to overcome the transactions costs that are much greater when they're involved in international trade. So a country that is geared towards exports is going to be more productive. I would also add that it could also be the case that the country that is getting out of its less efficient activities is also going to becoming more productive. So the transformation of the economy in a more efficient way is going to facilitate the ability of the labor market to generate higher wages.
The second question that I have is, there are many people who write that the solutions to Sri Lanka's trade deficit is to export more. Do you agree with that assertion? Would greater exports bridge the trade deficit, or would it further increase imports?
Well, you know, I have a problem because fundamentally, and a trade balance, basically the current account, is a reflection of the spending patterns of the nation. And it tells you a country with a deficit is borrowing. So it tells you that, in fact, it's not saving enough domestically, and it can't finance its own domestic investment. It has to borrow. It doesn't have enough high savings. So I see the trade balance as far more driven by spending patterns in the country. And one component of that would be fiscal policy. If the government saves more, if the government runs surpluses, the country will have a smaller trade deficit. If the private citizens save more, the country would have a smaller trade deficit. Those are the good ways, if you will, to lower the trade deficit. The bad way to lower the trade deficit is to invest less. That's another way to lower your trade deficit. So I think and by the way, let me say that my own country is following currently, the United States, utterly contradictory policies. Because while, as you pointed out, bilaterally, the Trump administration is obsessed with the bilateral deficits that we have with individual countries, so they're trying to make the aggregate trade deficit smaller. At the same time, What the US government has done is to pass large tax cuts and is currently this week talking about increasing spending on defense and non-defense. So the government is going to run a bigger budget deficit. And so with its one side of its mouth, it's saying it wants a smaller deficit, and with the other side of its mouth, it's actually taking action that is going to lead us to a bigger deficit. So when it comes to the deficit, you know, it seems to me much more about the spending patterns in the country, its saving and investment behavior, than whether or not it's going to export more or import less.
Is there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Professor, what is your view on Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement in increasing exports of Sri Lanka?
I'm sorry, just the last part of your question?
What is your view of Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement in terms of increasing exports of Sri Lanka?
Yeah. You know, the reason I'm at Harvard is I hate making predictions. If I could see the future, I would be on Wall Street. I think so. I think that a free trade agreement with Singapore, as part of a broader strategy of signing free trade agreements, which would have a number of effects that I think would ultimately lead to more exports for Singapore. For Sri Lanka. The first is to make Sri Lanka a more attractive location for investment. If you can attract foreign investors who come here and are interested in producing here, not only to service your market, but also to service the Singapore market and global markets, then it will be successful. I think the other benefits of going through the exercise of undertaking a free trade agreement, particularly of the kind that you're going to sign with Singapore, is that it isn't only going to deal with the tariffs at the border, but it's going to require other kinds of changes in your domestic institutions. And the best kind of trade agreements are ones which get you to implement policies that are good for you in any case. One example, I think it is critical for this country to have a system of what are called trade remedies to deal with unfair trade. And I think as part and parcel of the agreement, there ought to be domestically measures put in place to deal with fair and unfair trade. I think in addition, there's a question of the transparency of government regulations. That's also something that can be part of this agreement. There's a requirement to meet certain standards and objective criteria for certain regulations, whether it's safety of food or technical barriers in products. So there's the possibility of e-commerce. So I think a broad trade agreement can then get you to re-examine your domestic political institutions, and ultimately I think those can also make you more competitive. So these are all reasons rarely mentioned, I might add, in the discussion about the trade agreement, but where I see a lot of the benefits. You have a follow-up. I can't hear you.
The factors you have mentioned, aren't they already part of the WTO trade facilitation agreement, which we have already ratified?
The WTO trade facilitation agreement is really about the operation of your customs. I'm talking about much broader dimensions, whether it is in the services sector or whether it's technical barriers to trade. Now, there is a WTO agreement on that, but again, by undertaking these free trade agreements that are deeper, it allows you to go beyond what's in the WTO agreement. In a sense, the kind of agreement you're signing with Singapore would be called a WTO plus agreement. And that's why I think it can enhance domestic reforms. So there is the trade facilitation agreement, but it's just, if you will, the lowest common denominator for trade facilitation. I think you can do much better in the free trade agreements.
You have a question? Yeah.
Yes. The government tends to listen to people from Harvard who come and talk here. So the part that I find dangerous in this import and export argument, Taiwan and Japan, Korea, you mentioned China as well, they're importing more because they have industries that are doing value-added stuff and exporting them. So in Sri Lanka, we don't have development banks that lend money out like all those Asian tigers did. And as a result, we don't have industries. So making the tariffs disappear on raw materials that are imported will result in a net loss to the government in terms of revenue because there's no industries to now add value and export them. So are you all addressing the entire issue? Because obviously investments will come only in certain ways, private investors, but a lot of those countries developed because of development banks that gave long-term loans and took risks on industries that have become the base. So are you all addressing that is the question? Because just to speak about dropping import tariffs is part of the equation. Is that correct?
Well, I do think investment financing is a very critical issue. Whether your capital, I think you have quite sophisticated capital markets, but whether there's a need to supplement them with some governmental finance, you know, I think where there could be a plausible case made for that as well. I don't think that's the secret to the Asian success. There are many, many other countries who have investment banks, you know, who haven't grown that well. I think an outward orientation, though, is very critical. I think also it's hard to judge what you really are competitive in and what you really could add value in when you are putting these penalties on your firms by giving them costly inputs. So I have more optimism, I guess, than you do about the potential for the entrepreneurs of Sri Lanka to find profitable export opportunities if you create a favorable environment. Now, what I do also believe, if you look at the Asians, is that it wasn't simply the removal of the barriers to imports, and it wasn't simply providing finance, but there was very close collaboration between the firms and government, because government has a legitimate role in providing the necessary kind of public goods, whether it's the infrastructure or whether it's the training, that are important to export success. And that's something, when I look at the Korean experience or other Asian countries, Japan being another example, that's something that took place very effectively. And what I worry about in Sri Lanka is that I don't see a lot of partnership between the private sector and the public sector working for a common purpose in thinking about how the legitimate public role can actually be fulfilled. So I think there's a lot more in the policy arena that needs to be undertaken than the point that I was emphasizing. And so I would take your point about investment and an investment bank as just one example, but I think much broader collaboration in industrial policy approaches, not where the government replicates what the private sector should be doing, but where the government does invest in the things that the government needs to be doing.
I just wanted to make a comment with regard to that question. Maybe you can elaborate also. there is a myth that you have to be domestic firm to export. Because if you take the example of Sri Lanka, even if you take the rubber industry, the leading exporters are not entirely Sri Lankan companies. They're all foreign companies who set up in Sri Lanka. And a few domestic companies learned of those companies, and today they're competitive. Similarly, in the late 1970s, when the apparel industry started, there were many Hong Kong-based companies, etc., who came and set up here, and that's how we got started. I believe that Malaysia tried to make a national car project, but Thailand allowed all the global companies to come. So Thailand is a big exporter of automobiles, but there are no Thai companies. And even the example that I gave for India, the export champions are all General Motors, Volkswagen, Suzuki. You want to take that line of argument to explain that it's not necessarily your domestic companies?
Oh, I agree. I agree completely. You know, what you need is know-how, and firms that are able to operate across national borders and still make a profit are the most efficient firms, i.e. the multinationals generally are the ones who have the most advanced technologies. Just take Singapore as the prime example of a country that has had a huge number of foreign investors. Now, what you would like is for the foreign investors to bring the know-how, for natives and domestic individuals and other firms to learn from them, and so they can not only create export opportunities, but can also serve to assist the domestic firms in entering foreign markets and in demonstrating where their profitable opportunities lie. So I think attracting foreign investment is a key ingredient. When we look at the data, we think there are far too few foreign firms in Sri Lanka, and actually far too few immigrants in Sri Lanka. You have a lot of people working around the world, but you know, if you look at and attracting them back is a key challenge, because you have a high number of talented people who can bring know-how back, but also you know, if you look at Silicon Valley driving the American information technology sector, what you discover is something like 30 or 40% of the leading entrepreneurs are not Native Americans, not born in the United States. Most of them come from Asia, but we got Russians, we got them from all over the world. And so I think an openness to immigrants is particularly talented ones, not only those who bring their money, but those who bring their knowledge is a very key component of development and ultimately of excellence.
How many professors at the Kennedy School are non-Americans?
Well, I don't know the, you can hear from my accent, I'm a South African. You know, if I sit around the table when we have lunch, you know, I look and I see we got a Venezuelan, we got an Argentinian, we got someone from Turkey. There is an occasional American who manages to come in. But Harvard is in a sense a global institution and an example that you know, you try to find talent, and you find it wherever you think the best people are.
Professor, one question that I have before I put it back to the audience again is that we have this sense of value addition, that we have this national obsession that we have to add more value to our own raw materials and resources. Or even when we attract investment, we say that you've got to have a minimum value addition. What's your view on that?
Well, yes. I don't believe that. You see, it seems to follow, since value added per worker is high in a rich country, that what you ought to do is emphasize value added. But what's striking, and I didn't show you the picture, is that China seems to have gotten very, very rich, or rather done rather well, by assembling components from other parts of the world. And so they started actually, in a world of global supply chains, simply adding a small task, but doing it in great volume can accumulate into great value. And in essence, that's, in a sense, how the Chinese have generated a lot of their growth. So it isn't necessary, that's one point. A second, by the way, I said that para-tariffs is a word I think they invented in Sri Lanka. Well, in South Africa, my previous home country, they've invented a word called beneficiation. And what that word means is, and this is a very widespread notion in Africa, and maybe it is here too, and that is, if we have the raw materials, we should be adding more value to our raw materials. There's something outrageous about the fact that we have the stuff in the ground, the foreigners come and take it out, and they're getting rich off our core products, and we need to add more value. Now, sometimes it makes economic sense. Sometimes there's a path that does lead from the raw material to a more processed product to some finished product, but not always. You know, if you know how to grow coffee, it doesn't mean you know how to operate Starbucks. So at each stage of the vertical chain, of the value chain, sometimes you learn and you develop, but at other times, very different talents or requirements you need. Let me give you another example. Bauxite. Bauxite is the core raw material for aluminum. But it turns out that if you want to make aluminum, you need power. So the mere fact you've got bauxite in the ground doesn't mean to say you have the power sources that can turn it into aluminum. So the vertical thinking, the chain, of course, which thinks that automatically you should be adding value because you have the raw material, I don't think follows. It could be some cases, it might not be in others. And by the way, there's some other problem, which is if you think vertically like that, if we have copper ore, we should have copper, refined copper. Actually, what that means is your economy is going to be increasingly vulnerable to the price of copper. So they think that adding value makes them more diversified, but it actually makes them more concentrated and more dependent on the price of copper. If you have iron ore and then you go into steel, the same thing. So don't think vertically. The market works in mysterious ways. South Africa has become a major exporter of air conditioners. Now, how do they get good in air conditioners? Turns out it's from the gold mines. What do you mean it's from the gold mines that they learned how to make air conditioners? Yes, because it gets so hot down in the gold mine, 6 miles underground, that they had to develop air conditioners to cool the miners. And once they developed them, they suddenly found they had a comparative advantage or a competitive capacity in air conditioners. So the connections are not really easily predictable, and they're not always vertical. And the idea that we should always have a sequential value addition process, I think, is mistaken. I think rather you need people who can capture opportunities, and they can lie in strange places.
Okay, Professor, there is something called Slido, and we've got a whole bunch of questions on this, so this is like a rapid fire.
Okay.
Sri Lanka is finding it hard to narrow para-tariffs due to protests from local industries. Is there a better way Sri Lanka can convince these pro-protectionist lobbies?
I think you have to do it in a concerted and clear strategic way. If you try to take them on piecemeal and individually, you will lose the battles. And that's why I think without an ultimate goal of, say, 2 or 3 bans and a transitional strategy to get there, you will have a lot of trouble taking on the sectors individually.
But when you show that effective tariff protection, it's almost like monopolistic power you're giving them, right? This is fine excess of protectionism, right? This argument, because when you have effective protectionism of 200, 300, 400%, that argument also doesn't come up, right?
No, so...
It's excess protectionism, right? A business doesn't need that kind of protectionism.
Correct. You're giving them huge subsidies, and they're going to fight like hell to try to keep them. And so the question, and this is more for you who understand your politics than me, but I actually believe that unless you have a kind of a concerted reform in which you agree on the principles and you agree on the goals, and then you're flexible on the timing, you're not going to get there. So I would prefer, rather than a big bang and then a lot of exceptions, a kind of a sure and steady path to ultimately get to that stage.
The next question is an anti-dumping legislation a boon or bane for domestic infant industries?
Well, there are two parts to that question. Look, the anti-dumping rules are not perfect. I would prefer to see the use of what we in America called antitrust rules and what the Europeans call competition policy in order to determine what's fair and unfair. But it could take quite a long time to implement a regime of antitrust laws in Sri Lanka. Until you get there, I think as a second best option, you need something to determine what's fair and unfair. I think without any rules, it's much more difficult to liberalize. And so I would kind of say, as a second best approach, I would use anti-dumping policies, where foreign firms contravene those rules which have been established in the World Trade Organization. I would have some mechanism of implementing them. But I would not fool myself that that's an infant industry policy. That I'm doing, this is being occasioned by unfair practices of foreigners, and it says nothing about the ultimate potential of the domestic industry.
The next question is, can non-tariff barriers impede comparative advantage? How does a small country overcome these? And perhaps a lot of businessmen trying to export into India have complained about non-tariff barriers.
They have a legitimate complaint. It's a nightmare. Look, I think to some degree you can use the trade rules and the trade agreements to try to eliminate the most overt of these barriers. But what's very problematic in a country like India is that these can sometimes not be implemented from Delhi, but they are done at local levels, and they're very problematic and difficult to deal with. But I think to the degree that you can have rules, so that in a sense, if you're talking about sanitary standards, often these rules are used to keep out food products. To the degree that you have rules and you can pursue cases, you'll do better than if you don't. So I think it's a great challenge for the negotiators to try to deal with these issues, but they can be very significant obstacles.
Okay. The next question is on the lack of innovation. Is it simply that no one wants what we have? Is Sri Lanka the one country which doesn't have any comparative advantage?
No. No, I mean, look, you have some companies that I've visited that sort of blew my mind in terms of how innovative they are. I mean, some of your clothing manufacturers, I went to Stretchline, and they are doing R&D and coming up with products, you know, that are literally cutting edge. And you have scientists and you have researchers I don't think it's, you can't sit back and wait, but I don't see why you won't, I think you are innovative, and I don't see why you would underestimate the innovative potential in a favorable environment which rewards innovation. I think Sri Lanka will be an innovative place.
The next question is, how will Sri Lanka determine what sectors are good enough given that crops and textiles have been dominant exports?
I'm sorry.
I think the question is about how do you find what you can export next. So that's some of the Harvard work on Ricardo's work on.
Yeah, well, I don't think there are, it's sort of something that's easy to determine centrally. I think this is where you have to create an environment for the entrepreneurs to discover what can be profitably undertaken. I told you even in my simple example of comparative advantage that ultimately it depended on the market forces and the prices. And so I think you create an environment in which you encourage innovation, and then you've got to let 1,000 flowers bloom. I don't, now, you can build on some of your strengths, and I mean, there are some obvious areas. If you took tourism as a case in point, you know, it's obvious that you have to develop your tourist industry. You do have, if you took tea and you thought about, well, look at the example of Dilma, why is it that we don't have other estates that have branded their product in the same way? So we can look around and find some obvious easy wins, but I think ultimately what you want to do is let your entrepreneurs tell you where you're competitive.
There is some questions that I can sum up this way. I think in trade theory there's this Balsa-Samuelson model that talks about the gains from trade, but there are some segments of society that gets left out, right? That cannot be retrained, etc. And there seems to be this movement about Brexit, what Trump is trying to do. What's your thinking, or what's the Harvard thinking on this?
Well, I had a slide I wanted to show you. We in the United States, if you look at earnings in the United States, what you see is that looking over time, some Americans have seen significant improvements in their income. Actually, women have seen significant improvements in their earnings. They're still paid less than men, but there has been significant improvements. Men with college degrees have seen significant improvements in their earnings. But men who don't have a college degree have barely seen any increase in their earnings for 50 years. So we have and they're not poor men. The median male is earning without a college degree is earning $40,000 a year. But they were earning $38,000 in 1970. So we have a significant group of people who have not enjoyed the fruits of economic growth. And when you have non-inclusive growth, you get a very potent and unhappy political force. And that's what we have in the United States. Now, the narrative which Donald Trump has come up with is it's all got to do with the bad trade agreements and the immigrants who have come into the United States. I think that's absolutely false. I don't believe that it has to do with international trade. Trade may have had some adverse effect on some workers, but nonetheless, non-inclusive growth, significant alienation of groups of people, you know, can result in an environment in which it is very difficult to undertake trade liberalization. But then, specifically for trade, I do think you have to think about policies and even technological change as well, about policies that can help those who are hurt. Whether it's an emphasis on retraining or on job placement, or even some forms of compensation for wage loss. I think the United States has been severely deficient in helping dislocated workers, and it's an area that is now leading to political problems and unrest. So we have to think about creative ways in all circumstances. Part and parcel of a liberalization agenda should be a trade adjustment assistance program.
In fact, I've seen a study that shows that more jobs have been lost due to automation than due to trade.
Yeah, I would say I'm writing a book on this topic, so I won't bore the audience. But basically, if you looked over the last since 2000, employment in American manufacturing declined by about 5.5 million. Our best estimates are that the jobs lost due to trade were about 1 million. So 80% of the jobs were not lost due to trade. What is it? It's a combination of more rapid productivity growth in goods combined with a rather unresponsive demand. When goods get cheaper, people say, this is terrific. You know, we saw it in food. Why is it we have so few farmers? Because we became more productive in farming, and people say, well, there's a limit to the amount I can eat. I'm going to take the money I save, and I'm going to spend it on goods and services. Well, we've got the same thing in manufacturing. As we've become more productive in manufacturing, people are saying, well, that's terrific. I'll buy a few more goods, but I'm going to take the money I save, and I'm going to spend it on services. So ultimately, we're making a transition into a services economy. But I would agree with the statement that the changes, the deindustrialization in the US, and indeed it's something that's prevalent in all industrial economies, is far more due to the combination of technology and the unresponsive demand to the technological improvements than it is to globalization.
Okay, just a few more questions. One question is that they're asking is that why don't you just reform only the intermediate products?
Well, once you've reformed the intermediate products, what we've seen is that in turn raises the effective production of the finished products. So you have scope then to lower the tariff rates for the finished products without actually altering the amount of protection that those producers have. So I think there's an ideal opportunity in tariff reform to even retain some of the protection for the domestic industries while cheapening their inputs, to encouraging more exports, and passing on some of the benefits to consumers. So I think there's a better mix of policies that you could adopt, rather than just hold the tariffs at the same levels for the finished goods, because in effect what it means is you've raised their protection.
The other narrative that is commonly articulated is that these reforms will lead to large job losses. Can you give your experience of how it has played out in other countries, whether the extent of the job losses can be offset by the consumer surplus that is gained?
Well, I think this is there. It all depends on the pace of change, and there can be job losses. I don't think you can deny that. And the real issue is, are there opportunities elsewhere for people to find employment? The only way you get the gains from trade is through adjustment. So specific jobs may well be lost. But ultimately, the total number of jobs in the economy should be driven by your macroeconomic policies. You should have, you know, the central bank combined with your fiscal policy generating sufficient demand for labor. So there can be job loss. I'm not averse to saying you could have a safeguard policy in which you slow down the rate of liberalization where you see a lot of dislocation. That's what I urged earlier. So I would say, you know, for 90%, I wouldn't change things. But if an industry comes along and it says, we can show that imports are causing a substantial amount of job loss in volumes that are very difficult to absorb, then I think you should slow down the rate of liberalization. It should be continuous, it should be declining over time, but you should cushion that adjustment threat.
My final question then is that, you know, many of these decisions that you have raised, or many of the questions that you have raised, requires a significant amount of technical competency to argue these cases out, right? So the whole narrative has to move from a more emotional argument to a more factual one.
Yeah, absolutely, although I wouldn't quite put it like that. I do think that reform requires political leadership, that it requires a vision and the ability to sell it in a way that ordinary people can understand. And you know, that's not a skill an academic necessarily has. And it's not a skill that technical experts necessarily have. I worked for President Clinton, and you know, he could explain the economics to ordinary people far better than his Council of Economic Advisors. So I don't underestimate the need for political skills and conveying in layman's terms a vision that people can understand. So I think in combination with the technical experts, you need the political leaders who know how to communicate the directions and the policies to people in order to convince them that you have a vision and you know where you're heading. So ultimately, it's not only about technical experts. It has to be accompanied by the political skills to sell reform. That's the package, I think, that can bring about effective change.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Lawrence and Murtaza. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, ladies and gentlemen. However, we have a small token of appreciation to Professor Lawrence as well as for Murtaza. Of course, as I always say, I don't have any silver pins or Parker pens to impress a Harvard professor and a CEO of JB Securities, but we have a small token of appreciation. I would cordially invite Riyad Rifai, who is a volunteer for Advocata, to give these two tokens to Professor Lawrence and Murtaza Jafferjee. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for giving us this wonderful session in this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. And final note is Advocata is a free market think tank. You can join us, you can support us, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, as well as in YouTube. And this session has been live streamed on citizen.lk as well as in our YouTube channel and on our Facebook. So if you miss any parts of this conversation, you can of course log into our Facebook channel and retrack what has been missing from your end. Until we see you again with a similar event, as I mentioned earlier, we have a series of projects focusing on protectionism, and that's the common theme and the main theme for 2018 for Advocata. With that, I'm signing off from here, and thank you very much for joining us, and have a pleasant evening. Thank you.